Welcome to the On Your Mind podcast, where we believe mental illness can be temporary and transformative. Stay tuned for innovative, effective tools from experts in the field of mental health. Hosted by Timothy J. Hayes, psychologist. This podcast aims to change the narrative around mental illness. Move from a place of fear to a place of hope and solutions. Here on Your Mind.
Welcome, Michelle. It's good to see you again.
Thank you, Tim. It's good to be here.
I'm thrilled that you join us and share with us about the work you do. I'm hoping you could start us off by telling us a little bit about how you got into the work you do and what drives your passion for it.
Yes, I will. I became a mom a little bit later in my mid-30s and was coming out of a communications and education background and loved being a mom so much. It was just a wonderful adventure. I went back and got my master's in family education and became an early childhood parent educator. That's a program that we have in every school district here in Minnesota. And I thought, what would be more perfect than spending all my days with moms of kids my children's ages and just being in early childhood parent education all day. And so I started that work actually after my second child was born. And when she was just 15 months old and her brother was 3.5 or 4, I guess, he was diagnosed with cancer. And so here I was in this early childhood field and loving it and feeling like I had prepped myself, but I really didn't know how to do this journey of loss of dreams with their childhood no longer being this carefree childhood that I thought growing up and parenting should be. And we journeyed through it for 2.5 years. And then my son died and my daughter was 3.5. Wow. And she said to me, "Mommy, half of me is gone." And so now I really didn't know what I was doing. And I hadn't experienced even a grief of my own. You know, I'd had grandparents die that, was a sadness, but not this kind of devastating loss of something that I wasn't supposed to lose. And even more importantly, what my daughter lost, because this was her only sibling, her big brother. They adored each other. And then she said half of her was gone. And because I really understood the brain development and the identity formation and just all of the amazing things that happen in those little brains in those early years, I knew that that was a true statement. So that started me on the journey of saying, okay, I do not know how to do any of this. Not only do I need to figure it out for myself, but more importantly, I need to help her grow up whole and happy. It's not okay that half of her is gone. And this was actually 22 years ago. That little girl is now 26. And at that time, and even still today, there just were not, I thought I could, find whatever resources there were. And I found there really weren't any for how to parent this young child through her life with that kind of loss. And so I kind of knew back then when I had to embark on this journey myself, that someday I was going to have to share what I figured out. And so she graduated from high school in 2015, and that's about the time that I started Good Grief Parenting, to help parent, not just recover from loss and grief, but how do I parent in the presence of grief? Because it changed her life and mine just incredibly, upended everything that I expected for us. So that is what drives me. I've learned a lot that I never expected to learn, and I just really want to share that with other parents.
Oh, well, bless your heart for that. That's something that goes beyond words in a heartbeat. Mm-hmm. And you're right. There are very few resources for that. Mm-hmm. There are, people that do grief work, but the idea of how do you help parent a young child who's lost a sibling or
Yes.
so what have you learned about how to get from that shocking place and grief back to a healthy life with joy in it?
Some of the significant things that I learned were, first of all, that we have to go through grief. We think of it as this big gray cloud over life, and it can be that, but it doesn't have to be that. And we can't avoid grief. We have to go right through it. And when we allow it and feel it and go right through it, it really is something that can be good in our lives. It can be good for our children, as long as the adults that are helping them know how to help it be good, which is, how do you cope with this rite of passage of life? We're all going to experience it. And how do you gain skills from it? How do you learn that you are capable, that you can handle it, and that you can get lessons from it? There's goodness in grief, as hard as that is to believe. There really is goodness in grief and going through grief. And so I learned these things, that grief was not what I thought it was, that it can be faced, it can be carried, we can grow through it. And it really just reinforced the best things that I knew about parenting, because one reason I went into early childhood parent education was because as a child, I really was sensitive to the fact that my parents didn't always do for me and with me what I thought would be really helpful, like, listening to my emotions and helping me cope with big emotions and things like that. I just really was aware as a young person that there was a better way to parent. So where I've landed with all of this is that the best way to help kids with grief is just to do good parenting, which is helping them understand what they're feeling and that it makes sense that they're feeling that. Kids' emotions are indicative of, what's going on inside of them, and their behaviors are illustrations of their emotions. And instead of just, getting upset with them or leaving them alone with it, we can help them know how to handle it better. So I just really help parents get in touch with their own huge feelings and how their view of parenting has to change once you've lost a child. You can never parent in the same way again. There are all of these fears and guilt and doubts and things that overshadow this journey you are on. And then how do we help our children cope with this reality that we'd rather they not cope with, and yet learn that they can handle it and they can move past it. And yes, we can envision for ourselves a joyful place, and we can head for it, and we can even get there.
Well, one of the things that really strongly resonated with me was when you say to validate the child's emotions.
Oh, mm-hmm.
And I think about Harville Hendricks's work with the Imago dialogue, where that's a critical piece. The goal of that exercise is simply for the two people who are communicating to feel more connected at the end of it.
Yes.
Not that they agree, but they feel more connected. So as I listen to what my partner says and I feed it back to her until she says, yes, you got that, then I say, and this is that validation part,
Mm-hmm.
then I say, well, if this is what you saw and heard happen, and this is what you made it mean, then it makes sense that you would have those emotions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And when we get adults to do that, they leave that situation feeling more connected. And that's what happens when I validate my child's emotions.
Yes.
I don't have to agree with them. I don't have to say, I feel the same way you do, but I need to say, it makes sense that you would feel that. I understand that you would feel that.
Absolutely.
And that's a part of strengthening my connection to my child, which, of course, if I feel connected to somebody, we can get through all kinds of stuff together.
Yes.
If I feel disconnected from somebody, whether or not to eat with the plastic fork that came with the takeout food can be a knockdown, drag out problem.
And I learned that with my son when he was in those, 3 and 4 ages where he'd have his big emotions. And I learned that if I just acknowledged what he was feeling, sometimes in the midst of a tantrum, he would just stop and say, yeah. And then those big feelings would just leave. It's like, yeah, Mom, you get it. That is how I feel. And it was just magical. And I would tell parents, that it was magical. And so I really do help parents with the idea of emotion coaching that John Gottman does. And just how, and I say it really is magical. And every child deserves that kind of relationship with their parent. But when they're experiencing something like grief that everyone in the family can bump into at just the most unexpected times and have these emotional responses, it is just really a huge part of coping and growing well and healthy through it all. Absolutely.
Absolutely. Wonderful. True. So what are some of the other tips or tricks or techniques that you've learned to help people either parenting through this and or moving through grief?
One of the biggest things with parenting is to know that very young children grieve, whether they look like they're grieving or not. If there's been a loss in the family of a significant person in the family, or even a pet that was an important part of the family, you can know that whether they look like it or not, that child is processing that grief. My daughter said, Mommy, half of me is gone. And what could be more telling than that? But if I watched her, she didn't look like this broken, crumpled mess of a kid. She played, she acted like herself. But if I tuned in, I could hear her playing about her brother, singing about her brother. Kids process their grief by playing. And so we need to know that if they look like they're just not bothered, it's because they're processing the way they know how. And then the other part of that is that we want to protect kids from the conversation, from acknowledging this big, ugly thing of death and grief. And they really need for us to make it okay for them to talk about it and to invite them to tell us how they're feeling around it, rather than what we usually do, which is, well, if they're not talking about it, I'm not going to talk about it. I don't want to upset them. So I just invite adults to invite conversation and say, I'm really, really missing David today. I'm feeling so sad. How are you feeling about that today? Or when do you miss David the most? What things do you wish he was still here to do with you? Asking them questions like that give them an opportunity to tell you what they're thinking. That's really important.
Yeah, I have to agree. One of the biggest mistakes I see parents make is the assumption that they shouldn't let their children see them cry or be upset.
Yes.
And that they need to be strong for their child. And what most don't understand is that if I put up a front that I'm not upset and I'm strong for my child gets the impression that all those intense emotions they're having must be wrong because dad's not feeling it.
Right, exactly. And the other thing that goes along with that is using the words dad and died. That's another one of those things. I mean, I choked on those words when my son died. And I had to say, my son died. That was, I didn't want to attribute that word to someone that I loved, but it was the only word that accurately described what happened. And for my 3.5-year-old, she had been with us through our 2.5-year journey. So she was really aware of things going on. We had conversations that her brother was probably going to die. We had those conversations with her, and I remember, and with him even, and I remember thinking, I don't believe I'm talking to my child about this, but they needed to understand, she needed to understand that his body stopped working He couldn't do the things he used to be able to do. He couldn't play with her or talk to her or sing or do any of those things anymore, and we weren't going to see him anymore. She couldn't quite get her head around that at 3.5, but as she grew in her understanding of what death was. She knew that was what had happened, and she asked questions as she grew. It wasn't like one day I'd been telling her he was gone, and one day when she was older, she learned that he died, and that's like, oh, he died. Well, why, I thought he could come back. Sometimes that can be like a second episode to them. So just being honest with them with the words from the beginning is another tip, as hard as it is for us as adults to do that.
Yeah. And as you said, you've got to do your own work as an adult, because you're going to have your own grief and your own confusion and hurt. And then the other thing is to not assume that you understand what they mean when they say they understand, or that they understand all the words you're using. I remember somebody I was working with recently talked about, she was quite young, and they went to, someone died, and they went to the grave, and I think she said it was her aunt and uncle, and they told her, oh, so-and-so just went to sleep. Well, from that night on, this little girl was terrified to go to sleep because she'd end up underground and or she wouldn't be able to wake up. I think maybe they said to her that he went to sleep and he couldn't wake up. And so that child downloaded that very literally.
Yes.
And in her 60s and 70s, she has trouble sleeping until she uncovers that and realizes, oh my gosh, this is from that childhood trauma.
Yes. And that's just so important. And that's why, when we use the right word, it only means one thing. And so they are going to grow into that understanding. The other thing I thought you were going to say, which is why I smiled, was paying attention to what kids ask us, because sometimes, and then saying, why are you asking me that? Or what do you think happened? Or what do you think that means? And let them tell you, because sometimes we jump in to give them information we think they're asking for. And because their little minds are in such a different place than ours, that's not what they're looking for at all. And so it really is a matter of just finding out what they want to know. It's often much less complicated than we're going to make it, and let them let us take their lead, let them lead us to where they need to be. And the other thing that you referenced to that is so important is that self-care piece for parents, to just really be sure that they are sort of aware of their own feelings about grief and how to handle it, because sometimes our ideas aren't all that helpful or healthy, and we really need to do our own self-care so that we can care for our child. And it isn't an either or. We are going through this loss as a family. And so it isn't just either you take care of yourself or you take care of your child. You do both. And you're going to model for your child how important it is to take care of yourself, even when you're an adult.
That's one of the toughest things for me to get when I'm working with parents, is because if they go through the ultimate self-sacrificing, and they think it's wonderful for their child because their child is never missing a play date and never missing this and always has a smiling father or mother. But what they're not seeing is the role model of an adult who does good self-care.
Yes.
And they learn how to do self-care by watching their adult caregivers do self-care.
Yes. And you're just raising such important things about the way that adults do grief with kids that we just really need to be aware of. And that is, they are watching everything we do, even more than what we say. They're watching what we do, and we want to be good grief role models. And that's just acknowledging that that there's a reason for grief. When we lose something or someone important to us, yes, we're going to have these feelings. It's going to hurt. It's going to be painful. But then those essential messages that go along with that are, we can recover from this. We can feel better. We can do the things we need to do to help ourselves feel better. And we can get to a better place, and we're capable of getting through this. And those are just really good messages for kids to get.
Agreed. And important for their development. If they don't get them from us, they really don't get them.
Exactly.
One of the problems that we have is sometimes people come into therapy and they think, well, I'm only going to have a problem with arguing and fighting if my parents argued and fought a lot. But it's about a 50-50 split between people that come in and there was a lot of loud arguing and fighting, and it wasn't respectful in the family, and those people who end up in my office where they never saw their parents argue. So they don't know how to have a disagreement that's done respectfully, that's done with good communication, that involves negotiation if needed, because they never saw it.
Yes, that's true.
So there's a wonderful story to bring home the point you were making earlier. Friends of ours had a 5-year-old, very bright 5-year-old. And this was their first, they lived out of state from their in-laws. And this was the first trip where the mother of the 5-year-old was visiting her in-laws. And she was in the kitchen with her mother-in-law when her 5-year-old comes in and asks, "Mommy, what does pregnant mean?" Well, now, all the alarms go off. I'm going to be monitored by my mother-in-law. I have to say the right thing. And she goes through this detailed explanation about the man and the woman, and they fall in love, and the seed and the egg, and the this and the that. 20 minutes later, they're in the living room where the grandfather is watching television on a big screen TV, and the 5-year-old he's watching the news, and the 5-year-old walks up and says, "Look, Mommy, there's pregnant Bush."
Oh.
She was asking what the word president means.
Yes. Yeah.
And so often that very good advice that you talked about earlier is needed over and over again with parents. How do I respond at what is age appropriate? I don't have a degree in early childhood education, and I answer the parents by saying, you just ask a few questions of them when they ask you a question, rather than jumping into answering your question.
Yes.
Because you think you know what they're asking, you probably don't.
Exactly. Yes. Why are you asking that? Why do you want to know that? Yes.
That's a really good question. I mean, what made you come up with that right now? And if I have the context, I might be able to understand better, even if they can't put words on it.
Right. And the other thing you're doing is you're teaching them how to have conversations and how to give their input, which is, we certainly want them to grow up feeling like we want to know what they're thinking. And so we start really young by asking them what they're thinking and asking for their input and their opinion, and to explain why something. There's just so much goodness in all of that, approaching it that way.
Yeah, and it leads into all kinds of good training. The better part of the love and logic for parents training is you help your children make choices all day long. And so they learn how to make choices, and then they learn how to live with the consequence of those choices. But they only do it if they get to practice it, right? They only learn it if they get to practice it.
Yes, exactly. And I'm sure you see a lot of people, and this is where I often need to start too, and where I myself needed to start, adults who didn't learn these things from their own parents. And so they have to learn it all over again. That they didn't learn how to have reasonable discussions, or they weren't asked questions themselves as a child, or whatever the case may be. And so I'm sure you do a lot of guiding people in just some of these little tips that are going to make a big difference in their parenting.
Well, and little things like, what do you want and what do you need, right? What would be good for you? Well, if certain people were raised by parents that were too wounded, they spent their whole life trying to figure out what their parents needed. And then they get a spouse and they just spend their whole time trying to figure out what their spouse wants or needs. And they don't really understand what they prefer and what they would like to have. So even developing their own inner awareness about preference and desire is a fundamental skill we have to teach the parents, so then they can hand that down to the children.
Yes. And that permission giving and perspective taking, which is our two sides of that coin, are other parts of my good grief parenting approach, because everyone that's in that family that's experienced this loss of a child, which, I work with families where there's been child loss pretty much exclusively. Everyone has their own needs around that and their own feelings around that. And it's not there. We want to be aware of everybody, ourselves as well as the others in our family. And sometimes it's just a matter of giving people permission, giving yourself permission to think, okay, what do I need? I'm paying attention to what my spouse needs or my child, but what do I need? So that permission giving is really important. And then just being able to take the perspective of the other person in the relationship who had a totally different, they experienced the same event, but had a totally different experience than you did because they're individuals.
Yeah. So, the way I say that is they were present at the same event, but they created a very different experience.
Yes.
Right. They generated perception. And we all do this. We're living in a culture that teaches us that perception is a passive process. We open our eyes and we see what's there. But the science tells us perception is a very active process. Our minds don't record reality. They construct a different reality for each one of us.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why it's so important to get another person's perspective, to get them to be able to articulate it for you. And so you can step into some understanding of what they're going through, because they may have been present for the same events and not experienced anything like what you experienced.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Well, so tell us a little bit more about the work you do, how you do it. Do you do it online? Do you do it in person? And just give us some more of that, please.
I work virtually with families. I have done both a course and coaching. I do coaching and teachings that in video form as part of that, both individually and as a group with parents who have had loss of a child. And I present the good grief parenting framework that has 4 what I call heartbeats. And the first one is good grief beliefs, which is helping parents recognize what they think about grief and how to handle grief that they learned growing up that in most cases really isn't very healthy or helpful. So I just help them be aware of that and how to reframe their ideas about grief and what's healthy grieving and helpful, and then do some things differently. And once they get grounded in what I call those good grief beliefs, you mentioned the Grief Recovery Institute, and that is where I have my certification as a grief recovery specialist. And they talk about those myths about grief that most of us are very familiar with. And I help people reframe those. And then the other piece is really a common thing that well-intentioned people do with grievers is try to help them move on from the relationship and get over it. And sometimes if you're carrying your loved one forward, you're remembering them, you're talking about them, people around you might interpret that you're not healing. But that really is a huge part of healing, is to carry that relationship forward. And that's that continuing bonds theory of grief that is a newer theory that says, no, Freud wasn't right when he said you need to, move on from that relationship and leave it behind. So I talk about the bonds that we have with the person who died and how to continue those bonds, carry that relationship forward. Death ends a life, but it doesn't end a relationship. And all of the other relationships that we have that we need to navigate in grief. And then the third heartbeat is essential messages, which I mentioned a few minutes ago. And this is really a parenting focused heartbeat where we're just really teaching our kids the things about grieving and processing that are essential for them to grow up feeling affirmed and capable and well prepared to, face the losses in life. And then the last one is what I call choice actions, which is all of those decisions we make then based on those first 3 heartbeats. How are we going to function in our family? What are the choices we're going to make about conversation, about behavior, about limits and discipline, and all of those parts of childhood that are informed differently. They just really are when there's been a loss in the family and there's grief in the family. So how is parenting going to look different, and how are we going to be intentional about it? So I work with parents in virtual coaching and some, teaching videos, and do that as a group as much as possible so that they have other parents to get support from, because in the ECFE model that I come out of, that was just the huge part of the support that parents got was each other. And so that's really important as well.
So what does ECFE stand for?
Well, it's that early childhood family education, which is that program that we have here in Minnesota for parents of early childhood age children. And that's where I was a parent educator, where I would come and bring the topic, but it was all of the parents around the table with me that brought the wisdom, and we met every week and supported one another. And so that's kind of the model that I have for good grief parenting as well.
Wonderful. So how do people reach you if they want to learn more or work with you?
They can reach me through Good Grief Parenting. If you look that up, you're going to find me. That's my website, www.goodgriefparenting.com. It's also my Instagram, and I have a Facebook group there and page there. And it's also my Linktree link, which I will give you to put in the show notes. If people are familiar with Linktree links, which are now the thing that a lot of us offer, where it's one place to go and they can get my Good Grief Guide there, which is an excellent resource for any adults wanting to help kids grieve. They can schedule a time to talk with me and just pick my brain about whatever they're experiencing with children and grief. And I should say, too, that I do a lot of trainings for childcare providers and preschool staffs and people like that as well, that I do workshops for them, the coaching for the parents and the workshops for others. So they can reach me at Good Grief Parenting.
Excellent. Yeah. Excellent. Well, so before we wrap up, if you would just take a moment and center yourself and think, okay, so what's something that Dr. Tim didn't even mention that I wanted to bring up, or something we've talked about that I want to go back and highlight?
I think the one thing that didn't come up, that was really where I had to start way back when, is the fact that there is no prescribed way to go through grief. When I lost my son, everyone started telling me about the 5 stages of grief, which I'd never heard of. And I was not doing that. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm doing grief wrong. I really thought I was doing it wrong. And I was concerned because I had this daughter to raise. And I've since learned that those really are not stages of grief at all. They're stages of dying that we expect a person to go through when they themselves have gotten a terminal diagnosis. Grievers don't go through 5 stages. They may and probably will experience some of those emotions, but there is no particular way to go through grief. In a family, it's important to know that everyone is going to do it differently. If you have more than one child, they're going to each do it differently. And so be gentle with yourself as a griever, knowing that whatever you are feeling and needing to do for yourself and your family is appropriate. You'll know if you need more help, if you're having a problem, but just normal, ordinary grief can look so many different ways. And I think a lot of times people who experience it at the outset really are kind of intimidated about doing it the right way, and there isn't a right way to do it. So
Excellent.
that's what I would share, and just let people know that trust your own instincts and your own wisdom, and and be willing to talk about it and share with caring people and listeners in your life. And that's the first step to healing for everybody.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for sharing with
Thank
us
you.
and making yourself available to people and turning one of the worst things that can happen to a parent into a blessing for yourself and others.
Well, I hope so. That's the point. That's the hope. So thank you, Tim. I appreciate having the opportunity to talk with you.
It's been delightful, and I look forward to following you on the website and hearing if you come up with another program or a book. Let me know.
Oh, I will.
We'll have another conversation.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
You've been listening to the On Your Mind podcast, offered by Journey's Dream, where we support people through mental health challenges to a place of true and lasting well-being. If you love our show, we invite you to visit onyourmindpodcast.org to join the conversation, access the show notes, and discover our helpful resources. Thank you for listening.